Welcome to Nachtmeier Witness. Some nights feel wrong before anything happens. The air feels heavy, the room feels colder, and somewhere in the dark, you get the strange feeling that you are being watched. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who became witnesses to things they never expected to see. Some saw someone standing in the shadows. Some heard voices with no one nearby. Others found themselves in places that did not feel real at all. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a slow, dark atmosphere, subscribe to Nachtmeier Witness. Get comfortable. The night has already begun. I was not at work the day it happened, so everything I know came from people who were there, people who heard the emergency calls, and the pieces of the story that spread through the building afterward. Some details may have changed as they passed from one person to another. That always happens after something terrible. One person remembers a sound. Someone else remembers a warning. Another person swears they saw something that nobody else saw. By the time the story reaches the people who were not there, it can be difficult to know which parts are completely true and which parts became worse in the telling. Still, the basic facts never seem to change. Two maintenance workers were high above the factory floor in a scissor lift, working near the large overhead cranes. Someone below picked up a remote control and moved the wrong crane. One of the maintenance workers saw what was coming and ducked. The other turned around to look and was caught between the two cranes. The place where we worked was a large industrial building, the kind that always seemed darker inside than it should have been. Even during the middle of the day, the light coming through the high windows never reached every corner. Rows of machines filled most of the floor, and the ceiling was so high that the beams above us looked thin and distant. Large overhead cranes ran along tracks near the roof. They were used to carry heavy equipment, parts, and materials from one side of the building to the other. When they moved, you could hear the motors starting before you saw anything. There would be a low mechanical hum, followed by the sound of metal wheels moving along the rails. People who worked there every day became used to it. After a while, the noise became part of the background, like the fans, the machines, the warning buzzers, and the constant sound of steel touching steel. The cranes were not small pieces of equipment that could be ignored. They crossed the building above everyone's heads, carrying loads heavy enough to kill a person in an instant. Everyone knew that. We had safety talks. We had signs. We had rules about where to stand, who was allowed to use the controls, and what to check before moving anything. There were marked areas on the floor and procedures that were supposed to prevent accidents. In theory, nothing should move until the person using the controls knew exactly where every worker was. In theory, nobody should ever be surprised by a crane starting above them. In theory, two pieces of heavy machinery should never come together with a person between them. But workplaces are not controlled by theory. They are controlled by people, and people become comfortable. They become distracted. They rush. They assume someone else has checked. They pick up the wrong remote. They press a button before looking up. Most of the time, nothing happens. A mistake is corrected before anyone gets hurt. Somebody shouts, a machine stops, and everyone laughs nervously about how close it was. Then they go back to work. That is how dangerous habits grow. When someone gets away with doing something careless once, the danger starts to feel smaller. After the 10th time, it barely feels dangerous at all. The two maintenance workers had gone up in a scissor lift to work on one of the overhead cranes. I do not know exactly what part they were repairing. Some people said they were checking the electrical system. Others said they were working on one of the rails, or replacing something near the crane housing. Whatever the reason, they were high above the floor, standing on the raised platform of the lift with tools and equipment around them. The lift had carried them close enough to the crane that they could reach the area they needed to work on. A scissor lift feels stable when it is close to the ground. When it rises, it becomes something different. The platform is still surrounded by rails, and the base may be solid, but the height changes the way everything feels. The floor becomes distant. People below look smaller. Every movement seems more important. There is nowhere to step back if something large comes toward you. The platform only gives you a limited amount of space, and when it is raised near heavy machinery, that space can disappear very quickly. The two men were apparently focused on their work. They had no reason to think another crane was about to move toward them. The crane they were working on was not the only one in the building. There was another overhead crane nearby, running along its own track. Depending on where the lift was positioned and how the cranes were lined up, the space between them could become very narrow. That was the danger. If both cranes were moved too close together while someone was standing between them, the worker would have nowhere to go. Someone on the floor picked up a remote control. I never learned exactly who it was, and I do not know whether that person understood which crane the remote operated. Maybe the remotes looked similar. Maybe they were left too close together. Maybe the person thought they had the correct one. Maybe they were in a hurry and did not check. Some versions of the story made it sound like a simple mistake. Others made it sound like the person should have known better. The only part everyone seemed sure about was that the button was pressed and the other crane began to move. The sound of a crane starting would not have seemed unusual in that building. Motors started all day. Machinery moved all around us. The first warning might have been nothing more than the change in the motor's sound and the slow movement of metal along the track. The crane did not need to move fast. That was one of the worst things about it. Heavy equipment can kill a person while moving slowly. There is no need for speed when the object has enough weight and force behind it. A crane moving at walking pace can still crush anything caught in its path. One of the maintenance workers noticed it. Maybe he heard the motor. Maybe he saw the crane entering the edge of his vision. Maybe he felt the platform vibrate. However he realized what was happening, he understood the danger before the other man did. He yelled one word, "Duck," then he dropped down. It was the simplest warning he could give. There was no time for a full explanation. No time to say that the second crane was moving toward them. No time to point or pull the other worker down. He saw the danger and reacted. The second man heard the warning, but instead of ducking immediately, he turned to see what was happening. That reaction is completely natural. When someone suddenly shouts at you, most people look toward the voice or toward the danger. Your mind wants information before your body acts. Under normal conditions, turning your head takes less than a second and changes nothing. In that situation, less than a second may have been all the time he had. He turned, and the moving crane reached him. From what I heard, he was crushed between the two cranes while standing on the raised platform. One crane was moving. The other was fixed in place or not moving at that moment. He was caught in the closing space between them. There was nowhere for his body to go. The metal did not stop because it felt resistance. Machines do not understand what they are pressing against. They do not know the difference between a piece of equipment and a human body. Unless a safety system stops them or someone releases the control, they continue doing exactly what they were told to do. The worker who ducked survived because the crane passed above him or because he managed to get below the point where the two structures came together. I can only imagine him crouched on that platform, hearing metal move above him and knowing the other man had not gotten down in time. He may have heard the impact, He may have heard the other worker cry out. He may have been close enough to reach him, but unable to do anything. That part of the story was never explained clearly, and I never wanted to ask. The injured man then fell from the lift. I do not know whether he was knocked over the railing, whether part of the railing failed, or whether he fell when the crane moved away. The stories were different. Some people said he fell immediately. Others said he remained caught for a moment before dropping. The only thing I know is that he did not remain on the platform. People on the factory floor must have heard something. Maybe someone screamed. Maybe the tools hit the ground first. Maybe the sound of the fall was loud enough to cut through the normal noise of the building. Factories are noisy places, but certain sounds do not belong there. Workers learn the normal rhythm of a building without realizing it. A motor starting, a chain moving, a metal sheet dropping onto a table, those things blend into the day. A human body falling from height does not. The crane must have stopped quickly after that. Someone may have released the remote. Someone else may have hit an emergency stop. People would have started running toward the lift. Others would have moved back because they did not know whether more equipment might fall. Supervisors would have shouted for everyone to clear the area. Someone would have called emergency services. Someone else would have tried to help. This is where the details became more graphic, and also less certain. I was told that the man's injuries were so severe that part of his insides were visible. The person who told me said he was still alive for a short time after he fell. I do not know whether that was confirmed by anyone with medical knowledge. It may have been something a shocked witness believed. It may have been based on movement, breathing, or a sound he made. People who see a terrible injury are not always able to understand exactly what they are looking at. Time also becomes strange during emergencies. A few seconds can feel like several minutes. Still, that detail stayed with me more than anything else. The idea that he survived the crushing and the fall, even briefly, made the whole thing harder to think about. A sudden death is terrible, but there is something worse about imagining that moment between the injury and the end. He may have understood what had happened. He may have heard the people around him. He may have felt someone trying to keep him calm while they waited for paramedics. Or he may have been unconscious and unaware of everything. Nobody could tell me for sure, and perhaps it is better not to know. The building would have changed immediately after the accident. A normal workday would have stopped in the middle of whatever everyone was doing. Machines would have been shut down. Workers would have been told to step away from their stations. The area around the lift and cranes would have been blocked off. Supervisors and safety officers would have begun asking questions before some people had even fully understood that someone had died. There would have been workers standing in small groups, speaking quietly. Some would have seen everything. Some would have seen only the fall. Others would have heard the warning and turned around too late. People who had been in another part of the building would ask what happened, and each new answer would be slightly different. Rumors would move faster than any official information. In a place like that, everybody knows the dangers, but nobody expects the worst thing to happen during an ordinary shift. You walk past the same machines every day. You see the same people wearing the same work clothes. You hear complaints about overtime, broken equipment, schedules, and supervisors. Then, in a few seconds, one person is gone, and the entire building becomes a place where someone died. The workers who witnessed it would carry different pieces of the event with them. The man who shouted "duck" would probably replay that moment many times. He might ask himself whether he should have shouted the other man's name. He might wonder whether he could have grabbed him. He might think about the fact that he survived because he reacted 1 second sooner. People can feel guilty for surviving even when they did nothing wrong. He gave the warning. He ducked because there was no time to do anything else. Yet knowing that may not make the memory easier. The person holding the remote would have to live with a different kind of memory. Even if it was an honest mistake, pressing that button started the movement that killed a man. The action may have lasted only a second. The result would last forever. I do not know what happened to that person afterward. I do not know whether they were fired, charged, suspended, or cleared after an investigation. I do not know whether the controls had been stored incorrectly or whether proper safety procedures had failed long before the button was pressed. Industrial accidents rarely come from one mistake alone. Usually there is a chain of failures, and each one creates the conditions for the next. Maybe the wrong remote should not have been available. Maybe the crane should have been locked out while people were working near it. Maybe both cranes should have been disabled. Maybe the area should have been cleared. Maybe someone should have been assigned to watch from the floor. Maybe there should have been barriers, warning lights, or a system that prevented one crane from moving while maintenance workers were in the area. I do not know. Those questions would have been part of the investigation. For the people who worked there, the investigation would not change what they had seen. Reports can explain how an accident happened, but they cannot remove the image from someone's mind. New rules can be introduced, controls can be labeled, training can become stricter. Management can promise that nothing like it will happen again. But the workers who were there would still remember the sound of the crane starting and the single warning shouted from the lift. I was away from work when all of this happened. I do not remember exactly what I was doing when the phone rang, only that it seemed like a normal call at first. It came from my team lead. He had a habit of speaking without thinking, and most of us already knew not to expect much sensitivity from him. Even so, what he said surprised me. He told me that work had been shut down for at least the day, and probably longer. That was how he delivered the news. He did not begin by saying there had been a serious accident. He did not mention that a maintenance worker had been killed. He did not say that people at the building were shaken, or that an investigation had started. His main concern seemed to be that we would not have to come in. Then he said it was awesome, because we were getting a long weekend. At first I did not understand. A shutdown could happen for many reasons. A power failure, broken equipment, a problem with the building, maybe a safety inspection. The way he spoke made it sound like unexpected time off, nothing more. He sounded pleased. Only later did I learn what had happened. That part made me angry in a way the accident itself could not, because the accident was terrible, but difficult to fully understand from a distance. My team lead's reaction was simple. A man had died at work, and his first thought was that it gave him extra days off. Maybe he did not know the full details when he called. Maybe he had heard only that there was an accident and the building was closed. Maybe dark humor was how he dealt with uncomfortable situations. Workers sometimes joke after terrible events because they do not know what else to say. But he did not sound uncomfortable. He sounded happy. He treated the shutdown like a gift. I kept thinking about the difference between his experience and the experience of the people who were there. For him, the accident meant a long weekend. For the worker's family, it meant someone would never come home. For the surviving maintenance man, it meant carrying the last seconds of his coworker's life in his memory. For the person with the remote, it meant knowing one careless action had ended a life. For the witnesses, it meant trying to sleep after seeing something no one should have to see. The team lead did not mention any of that. He spoke as if the important part of the story was that the rest of us could stay home. The more I heard, the worse his comment became. I imagined the worker leaving home that morning and expecting an ordinary day. Maybe he had breakfast with his family. Maybe he complained about being tired. Maybe he planned what he would do after work. He had no reason to believe he would die before the shift ended. He went into the building, put on his work clothes and safety equipment, collected his tools, and climbed into the scissor lift with another maintenance worker. It was probably a job he had done before. That is what makes workplace deaths so disturbing. They happen in places built around routine. The person is not walking into battle or entering a burning building. He is doing the same work he did the day before. The danger is always present, but it is controlled by rules, equipment, and trust. Workers trust that the people around them will follow procedures. They trust that a machine will not move without warning. They trust that the remote in someone's hand controls the correct crane. When that trust fails, there may be no time to recover. I also thought about the warning. One word, shouted too late to save both men. Duck. The first worker understood and moved. The second turned around. It would be easy for someone hearing the story to say that he should have ducked immediately. But that is unfair. Nobody knows how they will react when danger appears without warning. The human mind is not a machine. It does not always follow the fastest path. A person hears a shout and looks for the reason. He turns toward his coworker. He tries to understand. That normal reaction may have killed him. After the building reopened, I expected everything to feel different. I wondered whether the cranes would still move in the same way and make the same sounds. I wondered whether people would stop what they were doing every time a motor started above them. I wondered whether anyone would be willing to go up in the scissor lift again. A workplace can return to normal on paper long before it feels normal to the people inside it. The accident area can be cleaned, the lift can be inspected, the crane can be repaired, the official notice can be removed from the board, production can begin again. But the workers remember where it happened. They look up when they pass beneath the cranes. They lower their voices when they talk about it. New employees may not know, but the older ones do. There is often a strange silence around deaths at work. Management may avoid discussing details while an investigation is active. Workers may be told not to spread rumors. Some people want to talk about what they saw, while others never mention it. The dead person's name may disappear from the schedule, but his tools, locker, or unfinished work can remain for a while. Small signs of his life stay behind after everyone has been told to continue. I was not there, and part of me was grateful for that. I did not have to see the fall. I did not have to hear the warning. I did not have to stand near the injured man while waiting for help. But hearing the story from other people created its own kind of unease. My mind filled in the missing pieces. Each version added another detail, and I never knew which details were real. One person said the crane moved without anyone warning the maintenance workers. Another said someone shouted from the floor before the man in the lift yelled. Someone claimed the remote operator froze and kept holding the control for too long. Another person said the crane stopped almost immediately. Some said the fall caused most of the injuries. Others said he had already been fatally crushed before he fell. The uncertainty did not make the story less disturbing. It made it harder to put away. When you know exactly what happened, the mind can place the event in order. When the details are unclear, you keep returning to them, trying to build a complete picture. I kept seeing the two men high above the floor. One notices the movement. He shouts, he drops, the other turns. Then everything changes. The accident also changed the way I thought about the ordinary carelessness I had seen at work. Before that, safety mistakes could feel annoying rather than deadly. A worker might step into an area without permission. Someone might use equipment without checking. A supervisor might rush a job because production was behind. Most of the time, the result was a warning or an argument. Afterward, every small mistake seemed connected to the possibility of something worse. The wrong button, the wrong remote, one missing lock, one person failing to look up. A few seconds of confusion. That was all it took. The factory had always been dangerous. but the danger had been hidden by routine. We had become used to the machines. We walked under the cranes without thinking. We trusted the systems around us because they had worked the day before. The accident showed how thin that trust really was. Even now, what stays with me is not only the image of the accident as it was described, it is the contrast between the weight of what happened and the careless way the news reached me. A man had been crushed between two cranes and had fallen from a raised platform. He had suffered injuries so terrible that the people who saw them would probably never forget. His co-workers had watched him die. The building had been shut down. Emergency services had come. An investigation had begun. A family was about to receive the worst news of their lives, and my team lead called to say we were getting an awesome long weekend. I do not know whether he ever understood how cold that sounded. Maybe someone later told him the full story. Maybe he felt ashamed. Maybe he continued joking about it. I never asked. By that point, I already knew what kind of person he was. The worker's death became one more story people told quietly at the job. New safety rules may have followed. People may have been more careful for a while. Then, as always happens, the building returned to its normal rhythm. Machines started. Cranes moved. Scissor lifts rose toward the ceiling. Workers complained, laughed, rushed, and counted the hours until the end of the shift. But for the people who were there that day, I doubt it ever became completely normal again. Every time a crane motor started, someone probably remembered that warning. Every time two pieces of equipment moved close together, someone checked the space between them. Every time a worker climbed into that lift, they may have looked at the rails and thought about the man who fell. I was not there, so I cannot say exactly how it looked or sounded. I cannot say how long he survived, whether he was conscious or which injury killed him. I cannot even say whether every detail I heard was true, but I know enough to understand that an ordinary shift turned into a nightmare because someone moved the wrong crane. One man saw it coming and ducked. The other turned to look, and somewhere below them, someone was holding the remote. I was the boss at the time, so whenever something went wrong, people usually came looking for me. Most problems at that job were small and easy to handle. A machine might stop working, someone might damage a pallet, or a delivery might arrive at the wrong time. Even when a worker made a mistake, it normally ended with an argument, some paperwork, or a warning about paying more attention. I had dealt with plenty of accidents too, but they were usually minor. Cuts, bruises, twisted ankles, and the kind of injuries that looked worse than they really were. Nothing had prepared me for what happened that day. The work area was busy, with people moving equipment, loading containers, and driving forklifts back and forth. It was the sort of place where you had to stay aware of everything around you. There were heavy machines, steel containers, narrow spaces, and workers walking between different areas. A forklift might not seem very fast, but it can cause terrible damage when it hits a person or traps part of someone's body against something solid. We trained people to keep their arms and legs inside the forklift, look behind them before reversing, and never assume the path was clear. Those rules were simple, but they mattered. One of the workers was operating a forklift that day. I do not know exactly what was going through his mind, but he was not paying enough attention. He had one arm resting on the bar behind him while he was backing up. Drivers sometimes turned their bodies to look over their shoulders when reversing, and he had placed his arm behind him as he did it. Maybe it felt natural. Maybe he had done it many times before, and nothing had happened. People often become careless with dangerous equipment when they use it every day. After doing the same movement hundreds of times without getting hurt, they begin to believe it is safe. He continued backing up without realizing how close he was getting to a large container behind him. The forklift moved backward, and his arm remained stretched out on the bar. The space between the forklift and the container became smaller and smaller. He should have stopped, but he either did not see the container or did not understand how close it was. Then the forklift backed directly into it. His arm was trapped between the machine and the container. There was enough force to almost cut it completely off. I did not see the exact moment the injury happened, but the results were impossible to misunderstand. His arm was nearly severed. Only a small flap of skin was still holding it to his body. The bones, muscles, and blood vessels had been badly damaged. His arm was no longer hanging in a normal position. It was almost completely separated from him. The pain and shock must have hit him at the same time. Instead of staying where he was or waiting for someone to help, he somehow got away from the forklift and ran toward the building. I do not think he understood how badly he had been injured. People do strange things when their bodies are flooded with fear and adrenaline. Some freeze, some scream, some try to keep working as if nothing happened. He ran. When he entered the building, blood was spraying from his injured arm. It was not a slow wound that could be covered with a cloth. Each beat of his heart forced more blood out. It went onto the floor, the walls, the equipment, and everything he passed. He was moving quickly and leaving a trail behind him. The sight of it shocked everyone. Some workers stepped out of his way. Others stood still because they did not know what to do. He was panicking, and running only made the situation worse. His heart was beating faster, his blood was moving faster, and every second mattered. If nobody stopped him, he could have lost too much blood before the paramedics even arrived. I ran toward him. I knew I had to get him to stop moving, but that was easier said than done. He was terrified, badly injured, and probably not thinking clearly. I caught him and forced him to slow down. I spoke to him as firmly as I could and told him to sit. I got him into a chair before he fell. Up close, the injury looked even worse. His arm was hanging by a narrow piece of skin. There was blood everywhere. It covered his clothes and had already begun collecting on the floor around the chair. The wound was open, and I could see damage that no person should ever have to see. There was no time to think about how sick or frightened it made me feel. I was the boss, and everyone around me was waiting for instructions. I yelled for one of the workers to bring me anything we could use to make a tourniquet. We did not have time to search carefully or wait for perfect medical equipment. We needed something strong enough to wrap around his upper arm and something that could be tightened. The goal was simple. We had to slow or stop the bleeding before he died. While the other worker ran to get what I needed, I tried to control the blood with my hands and body. I took the nearly severed arm and held it under my own arm to support it. I did not want it pulling against the small piece of skin that was still attached. At the same time, I squeezed his upper arm as hard as I could. I was trying to compress the blood vessels and reduce the flow. The blood covered me almost immediately. It ran across my hands and arms. It soaked into my shirt and pants. It sprayed onto my chest, neck, and face. Every time the injured man moved, or his heart beat harder, more blood came out. I had to keep holding him and keep pressure on the upper arm. There was no way to avoid getting covered. I remember trying to stay focused on the basic things. Keep him seated, support the injured arm, squeeze the upper arm, wait for the material for the tourniquet, keep talking to him. Make sure someone had called emergency services. Those small instructions helped me avoid thinking about what I was actually holding. The man was in severe pain and shock. His face looked different, almost empty in some moments, and filled with fear in others. He kept looking at me, at his arm and around the room, as if he could not understand how his normal workday had suddenly become this. I tried to stop him from looking directly at the injury. I told him to keep his eyes on me and breathe. I do not remember every word I said. I probably repeated the same simple things again and again. Stay with me. Keep looking at me. Help is coming. Do not move. You're going to be okay. I had no idea whether he was going to be okay. At that point, I did not even know whether he would survive. The amount of blood was frightening. He could have lost consciousness at any moment. But telling him the truth would not have helped. I needed him to stay as calm as possible. If he panicked more, his heart would beat faster, and the bleeding could become even worse. The worker finally returned with the things I needed. We quickly made an improvised tourniquet and wrapped it around the injured man's upper arm above the damaged area. I pulled it as tight as I could. It had to be tight enough to slow the blood going into the arm. A loose tourniquet would not help. It might even make things worse. I tightened it while still supporting the arm and keeping pressure with my other hand. The man cried out, but I could not stop. Hurting him in that moment might have been the only way to keep him alive. After the tourniquet was in place, the bleeding finally began to slow. It did not make the scene clean or calm. Blood was still everywhere, and his arm was still almost completely severed, but it was no longer spraying with the same force. For the first time since I had reached him, I felt like we might have a chance of keeping him alive until the paramedics arrived. I stayed beside him. I did not trust the tourniquet enough to step away, and I did not want him to move. I continued holding the damaged arm under mine, supporting its weight and protecting the small amount of skin that still connected it. My clothes were soaked. The blood had gone through the fabric and was warm against my skin. It covered my arms, hands, neck, face, and hair. There was so much of it that I could feel it beginning to dry in some places, while fresh blood remained wet in others. The other workers stood nearby, waiting for instructions. Some were pale. A few looked as if they might be sick. I kept telling them to clear space for the paramedics and make sure the entrance was open. Someone needed to guide the ambulance crew inside. Someone else needed to keep other workers away from the blood. The injured man kept asking questions. He wanted to know if he was going to lose his arm. He wanted to know how much longer the paramedics would take. He wanted to know whether he was dying. I answered as carefully as I could. I told him the medical team would do everything possible. I told him that the bleeding was under better control. I told him to keep breathing slowly. I never told him how bad the injury looked. I could hear sirens in the distance after a while. I do not know how long we had been waiting. It may have been only a few minutes, but it felt much longer. When you are holding a man's nearly severed arm and trying to keep him from bleeding to death, every second seems important. The paramedics arrived with firefighters who had come to assist them. They entered quickly, carrying medical bags and equipment. The room changed as soon as they took over. They were calm, organized, and used to handling emergencies. They asked short questions while examining the man. I told them what had happened, where the tourniquet was placed, and how long I thought it had been there. I explained that his arm had been crushed between the forklift and the container, and that it was attached by only a small piece of skin. I told them how much blood he had lost and what I had done to slow it. They moved carefully, but quickly. One paramedic checked his breathing and pulse. Another looked at the tourniquet and the wound. They gave him medical treatment and prepared him to be taken out. I continued holding his arm until they told me they had control of it. When I finally let go, my arms felt strange. I had been squeezing and holding so hard that my muscles had become stiff. My hands were covered in blood and my fingers were shaking. Until that moment, I had not allowed myself to notice. The paramedics placed the injured man on a stretcher. They protected the arm as much as they could, secured him, and began moving him toward the ambulance. He was still conscious when they took him away. I kept talking to him until he was out of the building, telling him that he had made it this far and that the hospital would take care of him. Once the ambulance crew had left with him, the area became strangely quiet. The emergency was no longer directly in front of us, but the evidence remained everywhere. There was blood across the floor and along the path he had taken into the building. The chair where he had been sitting was soaked. Blood had reached nearby equipment and walls. My own body and clothes were covered from head to toe. Only then did I fully understand how bad I looked. The blood had soaked through my shirt and pants. It covered my arms and hands like dark paint. There was blood on my face, in my hair, and around my mouth. It had gone down my neck and into my shoes. I must have looked as if I had been the person injured. I was also worried about what I had been exposed to. I did not know whether the worker had any illness or infection that could be passed through blood. At the time, my main concern had been saving him. Now that the paramedics had taken him, I started thinking about the blood on my skin, near my eyes, in my mouth, and possibly inside small cuts I had not noticed. The firefighters were still there, so I asked them for help. I asked whether they could use the fire hose to blast the blood off me. It probably sounded like a strange request, but there was too much blood to remove with a few towels or a sink. I needed to get as much of it off as possible before doing anything else. The firefighters agreed. I went outside and stood where the water could drain away. They brought the hose over and warned me that the water pressure would be strong. I told them to do it. Then they opened the hose. The water hit me with enough force to make me step backward. It was cold and heavy, striking my chest and spreading across my whole body. The firefighters sprayed me from different angles, washing the blood from my shirt, pants, arms, face, and hair. Red water ran down my clothes and onto the ground. They continued until most of the visible blood was gone. The hose cleaned my skin, but it could not save my clothes. The blood had soaked deeply into the fabric. My shirt and pants were ruined. Even after the water washed away the surface, dark stains remained everywhere. When they finished, I was completely wet. My clothes clung to me, and water ran from my hair and shoes. I sat outside to dry because I did not want to walk through the building dripping water everywhere. The air felt cool against my wet clothes. For the first time since the accident, I was alone with my thoughts. I kept seeing the man running into the building with his arm hanging by a small piece of skin. I remembered the blood spraying from the wound and the feeling of his injured arm pressed beneath mine. I could still feel the force I had used to squeeze his upper arm. My hands seemed to remember it even after I had let go. I wondered whether the tourniquet had been tight enough. I wondered whether we had acted quickly enough. I wondered whether the hospital would be able to save his arm or even save his life. Sitting there wet and cold, I also noticed something else. I could taste his blood. At first, I thought the taste might be coming from the smell or from the memory of what had happened. But it was real. Some of the blood must have entered my mouth while I was holding him. Maybe it had sprayed onto my lips, or I had wiped my face with a bloody hand without realizing it. The taste was metallic and unpleasant, and no matter how often I spit or rinsed my mouth, it seemed to remain. When my clothes were dry enough for me to leave, I went home. I took off everything I had been wearing and went straight to the shower. I washed myself carefully from head to toe. I scrubbed my arms, hands, neck, face, and hair. I cleaned beneath my fingernails and washed every place where the blood might have touched me. I rinsed my mouth again and again. The stained clothes went directly into the trash. There was no reason to try to save them. Even if the blood could have been washed out, I would never have wanted to wear them again. I would always have remembered what had happened whenever I looked at them. After showering, I put on clean clothes. Most people probably would have stayed home after an experience like that. I thought about it, but I knew the crew was still at work dealing with the scene. They had witnessed the accident too, and they had a difficult job ahead of them. I was the boss. I could not leave them to handle everything alone. So I went back. When I returned, the building did not feel like the same place. The forklift had been moved or shut down. The work had stopped around the accident area. The trail of blood was still visible, though the workers had already begun cleaning parts of it. There was blood on the floor where the man had run. There were drops, sprays, and larger pools where he had slowed down. The chair he had sat in was so badly covered that there was no point trying to clean it. We decided to throw it away. We wore protective equipment and cleaned the area carefully. Blood can carry disease, so it could not be handled like ordinary dirt. We used proper cleaning materials and treated every surface that had been touched. We removed anything that could not be safely cleaned. The workers did not talk much while we worked. Normally, that crew joked constantly. Even during difficult jobs, someone would say something to make the others laugh. That day, nobody had much to say. Every person in the room had seen something different. Some had seen the man run inside. Some had seen the arm. Others had seen me trying to stop the bleeding. A few had helped bring the materials for the tourniquet. They were probably replaying their own pieces of the accident, just as I was replaying mine. We eventually lifted the bloody chair and carried it to the trash. Even after most of the area had been cleaned, I could still smell the blood. It was mixed with the smell of cleaning chemicals, metal, and the normal air of the workplace. I knew the floor was clean, but I kept seeing the trail that had been there. The taste of blood stayed in my mouth for the rest of the day. I drank water. I ate food. I brushed my teeth again. Nothing seemed to remove it completely. It may have been partly in my mind by then, but it felt real. Every time I swallowed, I remembered that the workers' blood had been on my lips and tongue. Later, I noticed that blood had also gotten inside my nose. It had dried there without me realizing it. Even the fire hose in the shower had not removed all of it. When I cleaned my nose and saw the blood, the whole event came back again. I finally went home for the second time that day. By then I was exhausted. The emergency, the pressure of keeping the man alive, the cold fire hose, the cleaning, and the constant worry had left me feeling empty. I wanted to wash again and try to forget everything. When I looked at myself closely in the mirror, I noticed another problem. My mustache and goatee were stained. The blood had soaked into the hair on my face. I had washed and scrubbed it, but there were still dark reddish stains. Seeing them made me feel sick. I had spent the entire day carrying a visible reminder of what had happened without realizing it. I tried washing my facial hair again, but the stains did not come out properly. In the end, I took a razor and shaved my mustache and goatee completely. I watched the stained hair fall into the sink. It may sound like a small detail compared with a man nearly losing his arm, but shaving made the accident feel even more real. I had looked the same way for a long time, and now I had to change my face because another man's blood had become trapped in my facial hair. After shaving, I cleaned the sink and showered again. Even then, I did not feel completely clean. I knew the blood was gone, but I could still feel it on my skin. I could still remember its warmth soaking through my clothes. I could still taste it. The smell seemed to stay in my nose, mixed with the memory of the cleaning chemicals and the wet fabric after the firefighters sprayed me. For several days, I waited to hear what had happened at the hospital. The doctors were able to reattach his arm. Considering the condition it had been in, that was incredible. When I had first seen the injury, I did not believe there was any chance of saving it. Only a small flap of skin had kept it attached, and the damage inside was severe. Surgeons managed to reconnect it, including the bones, blood vessels, and other tissues. But the arm never worked properly again. Reattaching a limb does not always mean it returns to normal. The nerves and muscles had been too badly damaged. He had limited use of the arm and could no longer do the work he had done before. In the end, he went on permanent disability. His life changed because of a few careless seconds. He had rested his arm behind him while reversing a forklift. He had failed to notice the container. The machine moved backward, and the gap closed around his arm. That was all it took to end his working life as he knew it. People sometimes hear about safety rules and think they are too strict. They believe supervisors are overreacting when they tell workers to keep their arms inside a vehicle or check behind them before moving. They think nothing bad will happen because they have done the same thing many times. That accident proved why those rules existed. The worker did not expect to lose his arm that day. I did not expect to hold a nearly severed limb under my own arm while getting covered in blood. The crew did not expect to spend the afternoon cleaning a trail of blood and throwing away a chair. It began as an ordinary shift. One man stopped paying attention for a moment. Then he backed into a container, and everything changed. I have often thought about what might have happened if I had not been nearby. He was losing blood so quickly that he may not have survived until the paramedics arrived. If nobody had stopped him from running, sat him down, squeezed his upper arm, and placed the tourniquet, the outcome could have been much worse. I do not say that because I want praise. At the time, I did not feel brave. I felt terrified, but there was no time to think about it. I did what needed to be done because someone had to do it. Being the boss meant taking responsibility when everyone else was frozen. It meant putting my hands on the injury, holding the arm in place, and accepting that I would be covered in blood. It meant lying calmly to the man when he asked if he was going to be okay, because panic could have killed him faster. The paramedics and surgeons did the difficult medical work that saved him, but those first few minutes mattered too. I sometimes wonder what he remembers about the accident. He may remember the pressure of the forklift crushing his arm. He may remember running into the building and seeing fear on everyone's faces. He may remember sitting in the chair while I held the damaged limb against my body. Or perhaps shock erased parts of it. I remember more than I would like. I remember the blood spraying as he ran. I remember the arm hanging by a small piece of skin. I remember squeezing his upper arm until my hands hurt. I remember the blood soaking through my clothes and reaching my face. I remember the cold force of the fire hose. I remember sitting outside, wet and exhausted, while red water ran away across the ground. I remember going home, throwing away my clothes, showering, changing, and returning to clean the building. I remember the taste that stayed in my mouth all day. I remember finding dried blood inside my nose, and I remember looking in the mirror and realizing that my mustache and goatee were stained badly enough that I had to shave them off. The chair was thrown away, the floor was cleaned, the forklift was inspected. Work eventually continued. From a distance, everything returned to normal. But the injured man never returned to the life he had before. His arm was still attached, but it would never work correctly again. He went on permanent disability and had to live with the result of that moment for the rest of his life. The rest of us carried different reminders. For me, it was the memory of being covered from head to toe in another man's blood while trying to stop him from dying. Even after the blood had been washed away, the taste of it seemed to remain. Before the next witness tells their story, take a moment to subscribe to Nachtmayer Witness. This channel is for the late hours, when sleep is close, but the mind is still awake enough to notice every sound in the room. New true stories arrive here for anyone drawn to strange encounters, uneasy memories, and nights that never felt normal again. Leave a like if the stories have pulled you in so far. Now, let's return to the darkness. I worked as a buyer in a large manufacturing facility. My job was mostly office-based, even though my office was located close to the production area. I ordered materials, checked inventory, spoke with suppliers, dealt with delivery problems, and made sure the plant had what it needed to keep the product lines moving. Most days were busy, but they were also predictable. I spent a lot of time on the phone or looking at numbers on a computer screen while the sounds of the factory continued in the background. The production floor was never truly quiet. Even from inside my office, I could hear machines running, metal parts moving, warning signals, forklifts, and workers calling to one another. After working there for a while, I became so used to the noise that I barely noticed it. Each machine had its own rhythm. When everything was working properly, all those different sounds blended into one constant industrial hum. There were moments when the noise changed. A machine might suddenly stop, or an alarm might sound. Sometimes the whole floor would become quiet because of a power problem or an emergency shutdown. When that happened, everyone noticed. In a factory, silence can feel more alarming than noise. We all knew the production floor could be dangerous. The machines were designed to cut, press, bend, pull, lift, and move heavy materials. They could perform the same action hundreds or thousands of times during a shift without slowing down. They were useful because of their speed and power, but those same things made them dangerous when someone became careless. There were safety guards, emergency stop buttons, signs, and procedures that workers were expected to follow. Before anyone reached into a machine to clear a blockage or make a repair, the machine was supposed to be completely shut down. In most cases, the power also had to be locked out so nobody could restart it while someone was working inside. The rules were simple for a reason. Machines do not know when a human arm is in the way. They do not understand pain, panic, or warning cries. Once a cycle begins, the machine performs the action it was built to perform. I was also a member of the plant's safety committee. We met to discuss accidents, near misses, training, and ways to make the facility safer. Because of that role, I had received first aid training. I knew how to respond to bleeding, shock, breathing problems, and other emergencies until professional medical help arrived. The training was useful, and I took it seriously. But most of the situations I imagined were minor. I expected that I might someday help someone who had cut a hand, fallen, fainted, or suffered a small burn. I never expected to see an injury as severe as the one that happened that day. It began like a normal workday. I was sitting in my office, focused on my work. I cannot remember exactly what I was doing at the time. I may have been checking a purchase order or speaking to a supplier. Nothing about that morning had felt unusual. The machines were running, people were doing their jobs, and the production lines were moving. Then I saw two product line supervisors sprint past my office. That immediately caught my attention. Supervisors did not normally run through that part of the building. Everyone moved quickly when there was a production issue, but running was different. Both men looked serious, and they were heading straight toward the production floor. I watched them disappear through the doorway. For a few seconds, I stayed in my chair, wondering what had happened. My first thought was that a machine had broken down badly. Maybe there had been a fire, a chemical spill, or some other problem that could stop production. I did not yet imagine that a person had been caught in a machine. The sounds outside my office seemed different after the supervisors ran past. I could hear voices rising over the machines. There was movement in the hallway. Workers were looking toward the same area. Then, someone told me there had been an accident. A mechanic had been trying to clear a jam from one of the machines. Jams were not unusual in the facility. Materials could become stuck, parts could shift out of position, or something could block the machine during its cycle. When that happened, production stopped until the problem was cleared. Mechanics were often called because they understood the equipment better than most workers. This mechanic had apparently tried to get the machine moving again, but he had failed to shut it off properly. I do not know why. Maybe he believed the machine was already safe. Maybe he thought he could clear the jam quickly without going through the full shutdown procedure. Maybe he was under pressure to get the line running again. Maybe he had done the same thing before and nothing had happened. That is how many terrible accidents begin. A dangerous shortcut works several times, so the person begins to believe the rule is unnecessary. The risk starts to feel small because the worst result has not happened yet. The mechanic reached into the machine. While his arm was inside, the machine indexed. The word indexed sounds harmless when used in ordinary conversation. In manufacturing, it can mean that a machine moves forward to the next stage of its cycle. A part may rotate, a platform may shift, or a mechanical section may close and move into position. That was what happened while the mechanic's arm was still inside. The machine moved and caught him. Before he could free himself, it indexed again. The second movement partially tore his arm off. I did not see the exact moment it happened. By the time I reached the area, the machine had been stopped and the mechanic had been pulled free or had fallen away from it. But knowing that the machine had moved twice stayed with me. The first movement trapped him. The second caused the worst damage. Someone came to get me because I was on the safety committee and had first aid training. The plant nurse and the safety director had already been called, and they needed help. As soon as I heard that, I stood and followed. I knew I was expected to remain calm. I had been trained for emergencies, and I was one of the people others were supposed to depend on. Still, nothing in the training room had prepared me for what I was about to see. The walk from my office to the accident area was not very far, but it felt longer that day. People were standing away from the machine, creating an open space. Some looked frightened. Others looked completely stunned. A few had turned their backs because they could not bear to look. The machines nearby had been stopped. Without their normal noise, I could hear individual voices more clearly. Someone was calling for medical supplies. Another person was telling workers to move back. The atmosphere on the production floor had changed completely. When I entered the area, I saw the mechanic lying on his back. For a second, I could not understand what I was looking at. He was on the floor near the machine, surrounded by people trying to help him. The plant nurse was beside him. The safety director was there too. Someone had already called emergency services. Then I looked at his injured arm. Most of it was no longer recognizable as an arm. What remained was made up of broken bone, torn muscle, and damaged tissue. Pieces of bone were visible through the wound. They did not look smooth or clean. They looked like sharp white and pale fragments mixed with blood and flesh. The machine had not cut his arm in one clean motion. It had crushed, pulled, and torn it. That made the injury far worse to see. There was blood around him, though the damage itself was what affected me most. His arm looked as if it had been broken apart from the inside. The normal shape was gone. Where there should have been skin and muscle, there were exposed pieces of tissue and bone. I had seen injuries before, but nothing close to that. My first physical reaction was immediate. My stomach turned, my hearing seemed to fade, and the room felt strangely distant. I became lightheaded so quickly that I thought I might fall. I remember thinking, I am going to pass out. That scared me almost as much as the injury. The nurse and safety director needed my help. The mechanic needed everyone around him to remain focused. If I fainted, I would become another problem for them to manage. I tried to control my breathing. I looked away from the worst part of the wound for a moment and focused on what I had been trained to do. I reminded myself that the man on the floor was still alive. He was not an image from a safety video. He was a person who needed help. I forced myself to move closer. The plant nurse was taking the lead. She was far more experienced in medical emergencies than I was. The safety director was helping secure the area and making sure the machine could not move again. My role was to assist them. I followed instructions, brought or held whatever was needed, and tried not to think beyond the next simple task. Focusing on small actions helped me remain upright. Get the supplies, keep the area clear, watch his condition, help control the bleeding. Listen to the nurse. Do not look at the injury longer than necessary. The mechanic was lying flat on his back. I do not remember everything he said, but he was conscious. I could see shock beginning to affect him. His skin looked pale, and his body seemed tense even when he was not moving. Shock can become deadly after a severe injury. The body loses blood, the blood pressure falls, and the organs do not receive enough oxygen. Keeping him still and trying to control the bleeding were the most important things we could do until the paramedics arrived. The nurse spoke to him in a steady voice. She told him not to move and tried to keep him focused. I could hear fear in his voice when he answered. He must have known his arm was badly damaged, but I do not know whether he understood how severe it was. From his position on the floor, he may not have been able to see the full injury. That was probably a good thing. I tried not to let my face show what I was thinking. When a badly injured person looks at the people helping them, they search their faces for information. If they see horror or hopelessness, their fear becomes worse. We needed him to believe we were in control, even though none of us knew what the final outcome would be. The plant nurse and safety director worked quickly. We did what we could to manage the bleeding and protect the damaged part of his arm. The wound was so severe that ordinary first aid seemed almost meaningless, yet every action still mattered. The blood had to be slowed. He had to be kept alive. The paramedics had to reach us as quickly as possible. Someone was sent to guide the emergency crew from the entrance to the production floor. Manufacturing facilities can be large and confusing, especially to people who have never been inside them. There were long hallways, several doors, and rows of equipment. We did not want the paramedics wasting time trying to find us. Time felt strange while we waited. I do not know whether the ambulance took 5 minutes or 15. Each moment stretched, because there was nothing more important in the world than the man lying on the floor. The production line had stopped, and workers stood at a distance. Some were whispering, others stared silently. The person who had been closest to the accident looked deeply shaken. I wondered who had seen the machine index. Had someone heard the mechanic scream? Had another worker tried to hit the emergency stop? Had anyone been close enough to pull him away after the first movement? Those questions crossed my mind, but there was no time to ask them. The machine stood beside us, silent now. That was one of the strangest things about the scene. It looked almost ordinary. It was made of metal, controls, guards, and moving parts, just as it had been before the accident. There was nothing evil about its appearance. It had no understanding of what it had done. Minutes earlier, it had been part of the normal production process. Now a man was lying beside it, with his arm destroyed. I kept thinking about the fact that the mechanic had not shut it off. The safety rules were clear. Before reaching inside, he should have stopped the machine, disconnected or controlled the energy source, and made sure it could not begin another cycle. Yet people do not always follow rules, especially when they believe the job will take only a few seconds. Perhaps he saw the jam and believed he could simply pull it loose. Maybe shutting down the machine completely would have taken longer. Maybe production was behind schedule and everyone wanted the line moving again. Whatever his reason, the decision had changed his life in less than a second. The machine indexed once and caught him. Then it indexed again and tore through his arm. That second movement was difficult for me to imagine without feeling sick. Being trapped would already have caused terrible pain. He may have understood that he was caught and tried to pull free. Then the machine moved again before he could escape. I wondered whether he heard it begin the second cycle. I wondered whether there was enough time for him to understand what was coming. Those thoughts were not helpful, so I pushed them away and focused on assisting the nurse. The feeling that I might faint slowly became less intense. My hands were still unsteady and my stomach remained tight, but I was able to function. The first aid training began to take over. It did not remove the fear or horror, it simply gave me a set of actions to follow. That is one of the reasons training matters. In a real emergency, people may become confused, frozen, or overwhelmed. Training creates a path through the panic. It tells you what to do when your mind wants to turn away. We continued speaking to the mechanic. We tried to keep him alert and calm. I do not remember the exact words because my attention kept returning to his arm. The broken bone and tissue looked unreal. My mind did not want to accept that those pieces belonged to a living human being. The damage looked more like something from an accident training film, except there was no screen separating me from it. I could smell blood and machine oil. The two smells mixed with the usual scent of the factory. Even now, that combination can bring the memory back. There were also small details that stayed with me for no clear reason. I remember the hard surface beneath the mechanic's back. I remember the shoes of the people standing around us. I remember someone repeatedly asking whether the ambulance had arrived. During severe emergencies, the mind sometimes holds on to ordinary things because the main event is too much to process. Eventually, we heard that the emergency crew had entered the building. The paramedics arrived carrying medical bags, a stretcher, and the equipment they needed. Their presence brought a sense of relief, but it did not make the injury less terrible. They immediately assessed the mechanic. We told them what had happened, how the machine had caught him, and what we had done since the accident. The plant nurse gave them the important medical information. They took control of the scene with calm, direct instructions. One of them checked the mechanic's breathing and pulse. Another examined the damaged arm and worked to control the bleeding. They prepared him for transport while continuing to treat him. I stepped back when they no longer needed me. That was when the full force of what I had seen began to reach me. While I had been helping, I could concentrate on tasks. Once the paramedics took over, there was nothing to protect me from the memory of the injury. I looked at the floor, trying not to look at the arm again. My legs felt weak. I moved away from the center of the scene because I was afraid I might finally pass out. The mechanic was placed on the stretcher and taken out of the production area. Workers moved aside to create a path. The building remained silent except for voices, footsteps, and the sounds of the emergency equipment. I watched the stretcher disappear through the doorway. The accident area remained behind. There was blood near the machine and medical material on the floor. The equipment was still shut down. The safety director began the process of securing the scene for an investigation. Nothing could simply return to normal. The company would need to understand exactly what had happened. People would be interviewed. The machine would be inspected. Safety procedures would be reviewed. Investigators would ask whether the mechanic had received proper training and whether the lockout process had been followed. They would probably ask whether pressure to restart production had played a part. They would look for mechanical failure, human error, and problems with the safety system. Reports would be written, meetings would be held, and new warnings might be added. But none of those things could undo the second movement of the machine. The workers who had witnessed the accident were sent away from the area. Some looked pale and shaken. A few probably went home early. Nobody expected them to return immediately to their stations and act as if nothing had happened. A serious workplace injury affects more people than the victim. The people who witness it carry part of it too. They replay the sound, the movement, and the moment they realized what had happened. I had not seen the mechanic reach into the machine, and I had not seen it index. I had only seen the result. That was enough. I returned to my office eventually, but I could not work. The purchase orders and emails on my desk seemed meaningless. I would look at the computer and then see the mechanic lying on the floor again. What remained of his arm was still clear in my mind. Shards of bone, torn tissue, blood, the unnatural shape of something that had been a normal arm only minutes earlier. I kept wondering how he was doing. I wondered whether doctors would be able to save the arm. I wondered whether he would survive the blood loss and shock. No official update came immediately, and the waiting made everything worse. People began to talk about the accident. Some had heard only part of the story. Others had witnessed the whole thing. As the details spread through the facility, the same questions came up again and again. Why had the machine not been shut off? Why had he reached inside? Why had it indexed twice? Could someone have stopped it sooner? It is easy to judge an action after something terrible happens. Everyone knows the correct safety rule when looking back. In the moment, however, the mechanic may have believed he was doing something simple. He may have cleared similar jams many times. He may have thought the machine could not move. He may have been distracted or tired. He may have wanted to save a few minutes. Whatever the reason, the result was permanent. The accident changed the way I looked at the production floor. Before that day, I understood that the machines were dangerous, but the danger still felt distant. Safety rules were important, yet the worst outcomes seemed unlikely. After seeing that injury, I could no longer look at a machine in the same way. Every moving section seemed powerful enough to tear a person apart. Every guard and emergency button had a new meaning. Every shortcut looked like the beginning of another disaster. I became stricter during safety meetings. When someone complained that a shutdown procedure took too long, I thought of the mechanic on the floor. When workers said they could clear a small jam without locking out the machine, I remembered the exposed bone and tissue. People often believe safety warnings are exaggerated because most unsafe actions do not lead to immediate injury. A worker may break a rule 100 times without getting hurt. Then, on the next attempt, the machine moves. The lesson is not that the first 100 times were safe. The worker was simply fortunate. I also learned something about myself that day. I had first aid training, but training did not make me fearless. When I saw the mechanic, I nearly passed out. My body reacted before my mind could control it. For a moment, I felt ashamed of that reaction. I believed someone trained in first aid should be calm in every emergency. Later, I understood that feeling sick or frightened was normal. The important thing was that I did not leave. I stayed, listened to the plant nurse, and helped as much as I could. Courage does not always mean feeling no fear. Sometimes it means remaining useful while every part of you wants to turn away. Still, I never forgot the sight. Years passed, and many details of my time at the facility began to fade. I forgot the names of some suppliers, the numbers of old product lines, and the small problems that once seemed important. I did not forget that mechanic. I did not forget seeing the supervisors run past my office. I did not forget entering the production area and finding him on his back. Most of all, I did not forget what remained of his arm. The image returned at unexpected times. It might come back when I heard a machine stop suddenly, or saw a worker reaching toward moving equipment. Sometimes it appeared in my mind without any clear reason. Memories like that do not behave like normal memories. They remain sharp because they are connected to shock. The mind stores the sound, smell, and image in a different way. I could still remember how close I felt to passing out. The room had seemed to narrow. My hearing became distant. My legs weakened. I had to force myself to breathe and focus on the nurse's instructions. I sometimes wondered what the mechanic remembered. Did he remember reaching into the machine? Did he remember the first movement catching him? Did he know when it began to index again? Did he remember lying on the floor while we tried to help him? Perhaps the pain and shock erased parts of the accident. I hope they had. There are some moments no person should have to remember clearly. The company eventually returned to normal operations. Manufacturing facilities cannot remain closed forever. The machine would have been inspected, repaired if necessary, and placed back into service once investigators allowed it. Workers returned to their stations. Orders still had to be filled. Materials still had to be purchased. Production targets still existed. From the outside, the facility may have looked exactly the same, but the people who were there knew what had happened beside that machine. Whenever it stopped because of a jam, I imagine workers were more careful. They shut it down properly. They made sure the power was controlled before reaching inside. At least, I hope they did. Workplace safety often becomes most important immediately after an accident. Everyone follows every rule because the memory is still fresh. As months pass, the fear weakens. New workers arrive who did not see what happened. Old habits slowly return. That is why the story needs to be remembered. It was not a strange or impossible accident. There was no rare natural disaster and no hidden defect that nobody could have predicted. A machine jammed. A mechanic tried to clear it. He did not shut it off. He reached inside. The machine indexed and caught his arm. Then it indexed again and partially tore the arm from his body. Every step was simple. Every step was understandable. That is what made it so frightening. The accident did not require many things to go wrong. It only required one person to believe the machine would remain still. When I think back to that day, I always return to the moment before I knew what had happened. I was sitting in my office doing ordinary work. Two supervisors suddenly sprinted past and disappeared toward the production floor. A few minutes earlier, the mechanic had been doing his job like everyone else. Then a machine moved twice. By the time I reached him, he was lying on his back, and what remained of his arm was nothing but broken bone, blood, and torn tissue. I thought I was going to pass out. I managed to stay on my feet and help, but the image never left me. No safety meeting, investigation report, or passage of time could remove it. I will never forget what that machine did to him. One of the printers at the place where my brother worked had what can only be described as a complete failure of judgment for about 30 seconds. That was all it took. 30 seconds of not thinking clearly turned an ordinary shift into the kind of workplace accident people remembered for years. The man was working near one of the large printing machines, the kind that ran at high speed and never really seemed dangerous until something went wrong. Most of the time, the machine did exactly what it was designed to do. It pulled material through a series of rollers, pressed ink onto it, and kept moving with a steady mechanical rhythm. The workers around it heard the same noise every day and became used to it. After enough time, even powerful machinery can begin to feel harmless. That comfort is often what makes it dangerous. The printing area was loud, busy, and full of movement. Machines were running, rolls of material were turning, and workers were checking colors, alignment, pressure, and print quality. There was always something that needed attention. If the ink was too light, someone had to adjust it. If the print was not straight, someone had to stop the line and check the feed. If a roller became dirty, the print quality could suffer, and that meant wasted material, lost time, and complaints from supervisors. Everyone wanted the machines to keep running, because every minute of downtime cost money. The printer involved in the accident had likely cleaned rollers many times before. He knew the machine. He knew how it operated, where the controls were, and which parts moved the fastest. He also should have known that nobody was supposed to put a hand near a roller while the machine was operating. Those rules were not complicated. Before touching a moving part, the machine had to be stopped. In some cases, it needed to be fully powered down and locked out so it could not restart while someone was working on it. The problem was that proper safety procedures took time. Stopping a large printing machine was not always as simple as pressing a button and starting it again a few seconds later. The whole line might have to be slowed down. The material could need to be removed or repositioned, and restarting could create waste. A small dirty spot on a roller might seem easier to clean while the machine was still running. That way of thinking was common in industrial work. A person saw a quick problem and believed there was a quick solution. They told themselves they would be careful. They believed they only needed to touch the roller for a second. They had probably seen someone else do it, or they had done it before without being hurt. A dangerous action that works once can feel safe the next time. It was not safe. That day, the printer noticed that one of the rollers needed cleaning. I do not know exactly what he saw. Maybe there was dried ink, dust, a piece of material, or some other mark that was affecting the print. Whatever it was, he decided it needed to be removed immediately. The machine was still running at high speed. Instead of shutting it down, he reached toward the moving roller. Maybe he had a cloth in his hand. Maybe he planned to hold it lightly against the roller and pull it away before anything happened. Maybe he believed he knew exactly where to place his fingers. The rollers were turning too fast for that kind of control. When a machine is moving slowly, the eye can follow each part. At high speed, the surface becomes a blur. The gap between two moving sections may look wide enough, even when it is not. A hand can be caught before the brain fully understands that contact has been made. His finger touched the wrong place. The roller grabbed it. There was no time for him to pull back. The machine had more force than his hand and arm could resist. It pulled the finger into the moving parts, and half of it was torn off. The accident happened so quickly that the people nearby may not have understood it at first. They may have heard a shout, seen the worker jump backward, and then noticed the blood. A machine running at full speed does not pause to announce that it has injured someone. It continues operating until a person stops it. The printer pulled his hand away and saw that part of his finger was gone. The injury was immediate and obvious. Blood began coming from the damaged finger, and the pain must have followed almost at once. Sometimes people do not feel the full pain during the first few seconds because the body is in shock. They see the injury before they truly feel it. Someone stopped the machine. Another worker probably called for help. The injured printer would have been moved away from the equipment while people tried to control the bleeding. A finger injury can create a surprising amount of blood. Even though it is a small part of the body, the hands have many blood vessels. Blood would have covered the man's hand, the nearby area, and part of the machine. At first, everyone probably focused on him. They needed to wrap the injury, keep him calm, and get him to a hospital as quickly as possible. The missing part of the finger may not have been easy to find. People may have looked around the floor or near the roller, but the printing machine had been moving at high speed. Anything caught inside could have been pulled deeper into the machine. The man was taken to the hospital. The people who remained behind had to deal with the machine and the blood. That was where my brother became involved. After the injured worker left, someone still had to clean the press. Blood had gone into the machine, and the equipment could not simply be turned back on and used as normal. The rollers, trays, and internal parts needed to be checked and cleaned. Blood was both a health risk and a problem for the printing process. My brother went over to run the machine through. The idea was to move the rollers and internal sections so the blood could be cleared out. A printing machine has many places where liquid can spread. Blood could be carried by the rollers, transferred onto material, or mixed with ink. It could collect in gaps that were difficult to reach while the machine was still. My brother knew what had happened. He knew the printer had lost part of a finger, and he knew the missing section might still be somewhere inside. Even so, knowing something in a general way is different from seeing it. He began running the machine. The rollers started moving again. The same mechanical sounds returned. It was strange to imagine that only a short time earlier, the machine had torn through a man's finger. Now it was operating again as if nothing had happened. Machines do not remember accidents. They do not slow down because someone was hurt. Once the controls are pressed, they return to the same speed and motion. As the machine moved, the blood began to work its way through the system. My brother watched the rollers and the area below them. He was looking for blood, damaged material, or anything else that needed to be cleaned. Then the other half of the finger came out. It had been carried somewhere inside the machine after the accident. Maybe it had stuck between the rollers. Maybe it had been pulled along the same path as the printed material. It had remained hidden while the injured man was taken away. When my brother ran the machine again, the missing piece finally moved through. It fell into the ink tray. There was no warning. One moment, my brother was watching the machine run. The next, part of a human finger dropped out and landed in the ink. That image would have been difficult to process. A piece of someone's body was sitting in a tray designed to hold printing ink. It may have been stained with blood, ink, grease, or all three. My brother immediately understood what it was. It was the missing half of the printer's finger. For a second, he may have frozen. It is one thing to hear that someone lost part of a finger. It is another thing to watch that part fall out of a machine in front of you. The finger had gone through the press. The rollers that normally moved paper or other material had pulled it inside, carried it through part of the system, and released it into the tray. The machine had treated it like any other object caught in its path. My brother had to stop the machine again. Someone needed to remove the finger from the ink tray. It could not be left there. Depending on the condition of the piece and how much time had passed, the hospital might still have wanted it. Even if doctors could not reattach it, it was still part of the injured worker's body and had to be handled properly. The whole situation was disturbing in a way that went beyond the injury itself. The accident had already ended. The printer was on his way to the hospital, and the immediate panic had passed. The remaining workers were trying to clean up and return the area to a safe condition. Then the machine produced the missing piece, like a final reminder of what had happened. Nobody looking at a printing press expects a piece of a human finger to fall into the ink tray. The workers there had probably seen scraps of paper, labels, pieces of cloth, tools, or other objects come through the machine. Human tissue was different. My brother had to stand there looking at it while the machine slowed to a stop. The sounds faded, but the finger remained in the tray. There would have been blood on the equipment, but the ink may have made it difficult to see exactly how much. Depending on the color being used, the tray could have made the scene even stranger. A dark ink might have hidden some of the blood. A lighter ink would have made it more obvious. My brother told the story simply, but I could tell the moment had stayed with him. The printer had made one careless decision. He had tried to clean a roller while it was running at high speed. Half of his finger was torn away, and the other half had remained trapped somewhere in the press until my brother restarted it. It was the kind of accident that should never have happened. The man knew the machine was moving. He knew rollers could grab clothing, hair, fingers, or tools. He knew the machine should have been stopped before he reached inside. Yet for about 30 seconds, he stopped thinking about all of that. People sometimes imagine serious accidents require a long chain of unusual events. They think several things must fail at once. In reality, some injuries happen because of one ordinary mistake. A dirty roller, a worker in a hurry, a machine left running, a hand placed too close. That was enough. The printer may have believed the cloth or his finger would only touch the surface for a second. He may have thought he could control the pressure. The problem was that the machine did not need a full second. Once the roller caught him, the speed that made the press efficient also made the injury immediate. There was no time to correct the mistake. The same high speed that allowed the machine to produce large amounts of printed material also carried the missing part of his finger somewhere deep inside. By the time the machine stopped, the damage had already been done. The workers would have had to report the accident. Supervisors would have asked questions. Safety officers would have examined the machine and interviewed people who saw what happened. They would want to know whether the guard had been removed, whether the worker had been trained properly, and why the machine was still operating when he tried to clean it. The answer may have been simple. He thought he could do it quickly. That phrase appears in many workplace accidents. I thought it would only take a second. I have done it before. I was being careful. I didn't think it would grab me. A machine does not care what a person thought. The company may have held another safety meeting after the accident. Workers would have been reminded never to clean moving rollers. Supervisors may have repeated the lockout rules and explained what happened. For a while, everyone would have been more careful. They would stop the machine completely before reaching toward it. They would think about the injured printer whenever someone suggested taking a shortcut. But workplace memory fades. New workers arrive. Older workers become comfortable again. The warning story becomes something people have heard many times, rather than something they saw. The machine continues operating. It still needs cleaning. It still causes delays when stopped. And eventually, someone may believe they can save time. That is why accidents like this are important to remember in detail. The printer did not lose part of his finger because the machine suddenly became unpredictable. The press did what it always did. It turned at high speed and pulled anything that entered the rollers. The unpredictable part was the human decision. The man's finger did not belong near the roller while the machine was moving. The safety rule existed because the machine was too fast and powerful for a person to react. The worker ignored that rule for a short moment, and his body paid for it. I often wondered what happened at the hospital. I do not know whether doctors were able to repair the finger or whether the missing section was too damaged. Part of it had been torn away and carried through a printing machine before landing in an ink tray. Even if the piece was recovered quickly, it may not have been in a condition that could be reattached. Finger injuries can affect much more than appearance. The hands are needed for nearly every part of daily life. Losing even part of one finger can make gripping, lifting, writing, driving, and working more difficult. The printer may have returned to work later, but he would never use that hand in exactly the same way again. Every time he looked at the damaged finger, he would remember the decision to clean the roller while it was running. He might also remember the moment the machine caught him. Perhaps the memory came back whenever he heard the press start. The same sound that had once meant an ordinary workday would now be connected to pain. The other workers would remember too. Someone may have been standing close enough to see his hand go into the roller. Someone else may have helped wrap the injury. My brother would remember the piece falling into the ink tray. Each person carried a different part of the accident. For my brother, the worst part came after the injured man had already left. He was not there for the first moment, or at least he was not the person who was caught. He was given a practical job: run the machine through, clear out the blood, make the equipment safe. It should have been a cleanup task. Then the finger came out. The image was sudden and direct. There was no chance to prepare for it. A small object dropped from the machine and landed in the tray. Then he realized it was not an object. It was human. The piece had belonged to someone he knew, someone who had been standing at the same machine earlier that day. That realization would make the whole event feel real in a new way. Before that moment, the injury may have existed as blood on the machine and a story about what happened. The finger was physical proof. The machine had taken part of the worker and held onto it. Then it released it in front of my brother. There is something especially disturbing about finding a body part where it does not belong. A finger should be attached to a hand. It should not be lying in printing ink. The ordinary setting made it worse. This was not a battlefield or an emergency room. It was a workplace. The ink tray was part of a machine people used every day. After the finger was removed and the blood cleaned, the machine probably looked normal again. The tray was washed. The rollers were cleaned. The floor was wiped. Any contaminated material was thrown away. Once the cleaning was finished, there may have been no visible sign of the accident. But my brother knew exactly where the finger had landed. Every time he looked at that tray afterward, he might have remembered it. A workplace can return to normal much faster than the people inside it. Production schedules continue. Orders still need to be completed. A machine cannot remain unused forever because someone was injured. Eventually, the press would be started again for normal work. The same rollers would turn. Ink would fill the same tray. Printed material would move through the same path where the piece of finger had been trapped. To someone who did not know the story, it was just another machine. To the people who were there, it was the machine that tore off half a man's finger. I do not know whether the printer blamed the machine, himself, or the pressure of the job. People often understand that they made a mistake, but still struggle to accept the result. The punishment was much greater than the decision seemed to deserve in the moment. He may have only wanted to remove a small mark. He may have believed he was helping production. He may have wanted to avoid stopping the press and creating waste. None of that mattered after the roller caught him. The injury was permanent. That was the real cost of saving a few minutes. Many workers hear safety rules so often that the words stop feeling serious. Turn off the machine. Keep your hands away from moving parts. Never clean a roller while it is operating. The rules sound obvious. Because they are obvious, people sometimes believe they do not need to be repeated. But the printer knew the rule and still ignored it. Knowing something is dangerous does not always stop a person from doing it. People calculate risk based on what happened before. If they took a shortcut 10 times and were not hurt, the 11th time feels safe. The machine does not become safer because it failed to injure them the first 10 times. They were only lucky. The printer's luck ended that day. His finger entered the roller, and the machine tore it apart before anyone could stop it. My brother's role in the story showed how far the consequences of one mistake could spread. The injured worker went to the hospital. The supervisors had to investigate. Other workers had to clean the blood. My brother had to recover the missing piece from the ink tray. A single unsafe action became something many people had to carry. My brother did not choose to see part of another person's finger fall out of a printing press. He was simply doing the job he had been asked to do after the accident. That is often how traumatic moments happen. A person is not always the victim, and they may not even witness the original injury. They arrive afterward and see something they never expected. The finger in the ink tray may have only been there for a short time, but the image lasted much longer. I imagine my brother standing beside the press after it stopped, staring down at the tray. The piece of finger would have looked small compared with the machine that had taken it. That difference in size said everything. The worker had flesh, bone, nerves, and pain. The machine had steel rollers and a motor. There had never been any chance of the hand winning. The only safe choice was to keep the hand away. I also imagine the silence after my brother stopped the press. Factories are usually full of noise. When a machine is shut down, the sudden absence of sound feels heavy. The people nearby may have gathered around, then quickly moved back when they saw what had come out. Someone may have called the hospital to tell them the missing part had been found. Someone may have placed it in a clean bag or container and prepared it for transport. I do not know exactly what they did, but they could not simply throw it away. Even separated from the body, it still belonged to the injured man. There may have been some hope that doctors could use it. That hope would depend on the condition of the tissue and how quickly it reached the hospital. A body part damaged by a high-speed roller and covered in ink was not the same as a clean surgical injury. The machine had not cut it carefully. It had torn it. That kind of damage is difficult to repair. Even if the doctors saved part of the finger, the worker may have lost feeling, movement, or strength. He would still carry the accident with him. The missing or damaged finger would become a visible warning, though it was a warning paid for with his own body. Workers sometimes tell stories like this to new employees. They do not always use official language. They may point at the machine and say, "A guy lost a finger in that press." The story becomes part of the workplace. It is repeated during breaks, training, and moments when someone is about to do something unsafe. Some people listen. Others think it will never happen to them. The printer probably thought the same thing. He had been around the machine before. He knew how it worked. He believed he was in control. Then the roller proved that he was not. The phrase that stayed with me was that he stopped thinking for about 30 seconds. That description felt accurate. He did not suddenly forget everything he knew about printing machines. He did not become unaware that rollers could injure him. For a brief moment, he allowed the need to clean the roller to become more important than the danger. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he was distracted. Maybe he was frustrated with the machine. Maybe someone was waiting for the next print run. Whatever the reason, his judgment disappeared long enough for him to put his finger where it should never have been. People often think they can afford one careless moment. Around fast machinery, one moment can be enough. The machine did not need 30 seconds. It only needed contact. The printer's mistake began with a dirty roller and ended with his finger in two places. One part remained with him. The other traveled through the machine and fell into the ink tray in front of my brother. That was the detail nobody could forget. It was not only that the man was injured, it was what happened afterward. The machine had carried the missing piece inside itself like debris. Then, when restarted, it dropped it out. The scene felt almost unreal, but there was nothing supernatural about it. It was simply the result of metal, speed, and a human hand being in the wrong place. That reality made it worse. Nothing strange had to happen. No equipment failure was needed. The machine performed exactly as designed. The worker was the one who made the error. After the accident, the company may have changed procedures or added guards. They might have required machines to be shut down more completely before rollers were cleaned. Perhaps supervisors watched workers more closely for a while. Those steps were useful, but they came too late for the printer. Safety improvements often follow injuries that could have been prevented by rules already in place. The rules existed. The man ignored them. The accident became proof of why they mattered. The printing machine eventually returned to service. The workers returned too. My brother continued doing his job. The injured printer may have been gone for a long time, recovering and learning what he could still do with his damaged hand. The press continued turning out printed material as if the accident had never happened. That was the coldest part of industrial work. A machine could tear off part of a person and then return to normal operation after being cleaned. The person could not. The machine needed maintenance. The worker needed surgery, pain treatment, rehabilitation, and possibly a new way of working. Its rollers could be wiped down. His finger could never be restored so easily. Years later, my brother still remembered the moment the missing piece fell into the ink tray. He had seen the blood being cleared from the machine, but he had not expected the machine to give back part of the man. It was one of those images that stayed clear because it happened so suddenly. He started the press. The rollers moved. The blood ran through. Then half a finger dropped into the ink. The entire accident came down to a small number of decisions and seconds. A printer saw a dirty roller. He chose not to stop the machine. He reached toward it. The roller caught his finger. Half was torn away. The other half remained inside until my brother ran the press again. There was nothing complicated about the story. That was why it was so disturbing. A normal job, a familiar machine, and one careless moment were enough to change a man's hand for the rest of his life. The machine kept running. The worker did not leave it whole. This happened many years ago, when I worked at a small college. It was not a huge university with thousands of people moving across a wide campus. It was the kind of place where the buildings were close together, the staff knew one another, and familiar faces appeared in the same hallways every day. Even if you did not know someone well, you usually recognized them. You knew which office they worked in, which department they belonged to, or which parking space they used. The college felt quiet compared with larger schools, and most days passed without anything serious happening. My job kept me around the staff, faculty, and students, so I saw the normal rhythm of campus life every day. Students hurried to class, complained about assignments, and waited outside offices to ask questions. Professors carried books and papers from one building to another. Office employees answered phones, helped students complete forms, and dealt with the endless small problems that come with running a college. The financial aid office was one of the busiest places on campus. Students went there when they needed help paying for school, had questions about loans, or were worried about missing documents. For many students, the people in that office could decide whether they were able to continue their education. The employees had to deal with worried students, frustrated parents, forms, deadlines, and government rules. The woman who worked there was one of those familiar people on campus. I did not know every detail of her private life, and at the time, there was no reason I should have. She came to work, did her job, spoke with coworkers, and helped students like everyone else. We later learned that she had an estranged boyfriend. I do not know exactly how long they had been separated or what had happened between them. I do not know whether she had warned anyone that she was afraid of him. Perhaps some of her close coworkers knew there had been trouble. Maybe she had told friends that he would not leave her alone. It is also possible that nobody at the college understood how dangerous he was until the day he came onto campus. The word estranged can cover many different situations. Sometimes it means two people have simply separated and are trying to move on. Other times, it means one person has left and the other refuses to accept it. It can mean arguments, threats, unwanted calls, or attempts to regain control. Whatever had happened between them, the relationship was over from her point of view. He did not accept that. The college was a public place, but it did not feel like somewhere a person would come to commit murder. People walked into the buildings throughout the day. Students brought friends and family members with them. Delivery drivers entered offices. Visitors asked for directions. Unless someone was acting strangely or carrying an obvious weapon, they might not attract attention immediately. The man came to the college during the day. I do not know whether he had planned the exact time or whether he simply knew where she worked. He entered the building and went to the financial aid office. There were employees working inside and several students were nearby. It was an ordinary workday until he arrived. The woman was in front of her coworkers and students when he attacked her. He stabbed her. The attack happened in the office, in a place where people were supposed to be filling out forms, asking questions, and doing their jobs. There was no private argument hidden behind a closed door. He attacked her in front of everyone. People nearby had almost no time to understand what was happening. One moment, they were working or waiting for assistance. The next, a man was attacking a woman with a knife. There must have been shouting. Someone may have screamed her name. Chairs may have been pushed over as people tried to move away or reach her. Students who had come to ask about financial aid suddenly found themselves watching a murder. I was not standing in the office when the stabbing began, so I cannot describe every movement. I only knew what was told afterward and what became clear from the response across campus. The man stabbed her badly enough that there was no chance for the people around her to save her. Someone called campus police. Because the college was small, the officers were not far away. They responded and arrested the attacker before he could escape. They did not arrive in time to help her. That was the part that stayed with everyone. The police caught him, but the arrest could not change what had already happened. The threat was stopped, but the woman was dying or already dead. Campus police officers are trained for emergencies, but most of their daily work at a small college is not like that. They handle parking complaints, unlocked doors, arguments, safety checks, and students who have made poor decisions. They may respond to medical calls or remove someone who is causing trouble. That day, they arrived at an office where a woman had been stabbed to death. The man who had attacked her was still there. The officers had to control him, take the knife, place him under arrest, and make sure nobody else was in danger. At the same time, other people had to try to help the woman and clear the office. Emergency medical services were called, but some injuries cannot be repaired, no matter how quickly help arrives. She died there. The office that had been full of ordinary conversation became a crime scene. The students and staff who witnessed it were taken away from the immediate area. Police officers separated people so they could understand what each person had seen. Some witnesses were probably unable to speak clearly at first. Others may have repeated the same few sentences because their minds had not yet processed what happened. Blood was on the floor and furniture. Personal items, office supplies, and paperwork were left where people had dropped them. The police closed the area and kept everyone away. News spread across the college quickly, but not clearly. At first, people heard only that there had been an incident in the financial aid office. Then someone said a person had been injured. Another person said there had been a stabbing. By the time the truth became known, the campus had changed. A member of staff had been murdered inside one of the college buildings. She had been killed by a man she had once been close to. Everyone started asking questions. How had he entered? Did anyone know he was dangerous? Had he threatened her before? Could security have stopped him? Was anyone else hurt? Was the campus still safe? The most important question had no useful answer. Why had he done it? There might have been an explanation involving anger, jealousy, control, or revenge, but none of those things could truly explain it. Ending a relationship was not a reason to kill someone. Whatever he believed she had done, he had chosen to carry a knife into her workplace and attack her in front of other people. He had turned his anger into something permanent. The woman's coworkers had to live with what they saw. They may have tried to help her. Someone may have placed pressure on her wounds. Someone may have held her hand or spoken to her while waiting for paramedics. Even if they could do nothing, they were close enough to see her final moments. Those people had worked beside her during ordinary days. They had shared conversations, lunch breaks, complaints, and small jokes. Then they watched her die in the same office where they had expected to complete another normal shift. The students who witnessed the attack were changed too. Most students arrive at college believing the campus is a safe place. They worry about grades, money, friendships, and their future. They do not expect to watch someone being murdered while visiting an administrative office. Some of those students may have been 18 or 19 years old. They may never have seen serious violence before. They had gone into the office because of a form or question. They left as witnesses in a murder investigation. For them, the memory would always be connected to an ordinary part of their college experience. The room, the desk, the sound of the attack, the woman falling, the police arriving after it was too late. The college brought in counselors and offered support. That is what organizations do after a terrible event. They send messages, arrange meetings, and tell people help is available. Those steps are important, but they cannot remove what witnesses saw. People react to violent events in different ways. Some want to talk about every detail. Others become silent. Some cry immediately. Others feel nothing at first and begin struggling days later. A person might return home and act normal until they hear a sound that reminds them of the attack. They might wake during the night with the scene playing again in their mind. They might feel guilty because they survived or because they were unable to stop the attacker. The coworkers probably questioned their own actions. Could they have moved faster? Could they have pulled him away? Could they have warned her? Those questions are common after trauma, even when the witnesses had no real chance to change the outcome. A person holding a knife can injure someone in seconds. The people nearby were not trained police officers, and they could easily have been killed too. Still, knowing that would not necessarily stop the guilt. The financial aid office remained closed for some time. The police needed to gather evidence, photograph the room, and interview everyone involved. The college had to decide how and when the office could reopen. Eventually, it did. Students still needed financial assistance. Forms still had deadlines. The work could not stop forever. But the office was no longer simply an office. The people who returned knew where she had fallen. They knew where the attacker had stood. Even after the room was cleaned and the furniture was moved, the memory remained. New students may have entered later without knowing what happened there. They saw desks, computers, chairs, and employees. The people who had been there that day saw something else. For a while, the entire college felt different. Security became more visible. People paid closer attention to visitors. Staff members who had difficult former partners or family problems may have become more afraid. Doors that had always been left open were locked. Employees looked twice when an unfamiliar person entered. Campus police probably reviewed their procedures. Administrators discussed access, warning signs, and emergency response times. It was natural to search for a way the murder could have been prevented. Maybe there was something the college could have done differently. Maybe there were threats nobody had reported. Maybe the man should have been legally prevented from contacting her. But sometimes the worst part is that a person can choose violence without giving everyone around the victim enough time to stop it. The man came to her workplace with a knife. He attacked quickly. By the time campus police arrived, she was dead. He was arrested, but arrest is not the same as rescue. The justice system could punish him, but it could not return her to her family, friends, or coworkers. For some time after the murder, conversations across campus returned to the same subject. People wanted updates about the case. They wanted to know what charges he faced and what he had said after his arrest. Eventually, the news became less frequent. The investigation moved forward. The college held memorials and continued operating. Life on campus returned to its normal shape. Students attended class, professors taught, the financial aid office reopened. But normal did not mean the event had been forgotten. It meant people learned to carry it while continuing with their lives. The murder was the worst thing that happened while I worked there, but it was not the only sudden death. Sometime later, a healthy professor, who was only about 40 years old, died of a heart attack while meeting with a student. It was not violent in the same way as the stabbing. Nobody attacked him. There was no weapon, arrest, or crime scene. Still, the suddenness of it shocked everyone, especially the student who was with him. The professor was considered healthy. He was not an elderly man with a long illness. He was about 40, still young enough that most people would not expect him to suddenly collapse and die. He had probably come to work that day feeling normal. He may have taught classes, spoken with coworkers, answered emails, and prepared for the meeting. The student entered his office expecting a normal conversation. Maybe they were discussing an assignment, a grade, a research project, or the student's plans. Meetings between professors and students happened every day. They are usually forgettable. This one became something the student would remember for life. During the meeting, the professor suffered a heart attack. I do not know whether he first complained of pain, became short of breath, or simply collapsed. Heart attacks do not always happen the way people expect. A person may feel pressure in the chest, pain in the arm or jaw, nausea, weakness, or sudden fear. Sometimes the person has time to say something is wrong. Sometimes they fall before anyone understands what is happening. The student was alone with him when he collapsed. That student had to react without preparation. One moment, they were speaking with a healthy adult. The next, the professor was unresponsive or struggling to breathe. The student may have called for help, shouted into the hallway, or tried to use the phone. Staff members came, campus police or medical responders were contacted, and people attempted to save the professor. But he died. The student had done nothing wrong. There was probably nothing the student could have done differently. Even so, the experience shook them badly. Watching someone die suddenly can make a person feel responsible, especially when they are the only witness. The student may have wondered whether they missed a warning sign. Should they have called for help sooner? Should they have started CPR? Should they have known what to do? Those thoughts can stay with someone long after everyone else has accepted that the death was unavoidable. The student had entered the office expecting advice or a simple conversation. They left after watching a man die. That kind of event changes the way a person sees ordinary life. A healthy adult can be speaking one moment and gone the next. There is no warning, no time to prepare, and no chance to say goodbye. The professor's death was not as horrific as the murder in financial aid, but it still affected the campus. He had colleagues, students, friends, and family. People had seen him earlier that day without knowing it would be the last time. His office may have remained exactly as he left it. Papers on the desk, books on shelves, a cup, a jacket, or notes for the next class. Those ordinary objects become painful after someone dies suddenly. They show that the person expected to return. The professor had probably made plans for the next day, the next week, and the next term. He may have promised to return papers, attend a meeting, or speak with another student. All those plans ended during one meeting. The college again had to notify people and offer counseling. Students who knew the professor were shocked. Some had seen him in class recently and could not believe he was gone. Others may have had unfinished work or unresolved disagreements with him. His coworkers had to take over his responsibilities. Classes needed new instructors. Students still needed grades and guidance. The college had already experienced a violent death, so another sudden loss may have reopened fears that had never fully gone away. The two incidents were very different. One woman was murdered by someone who chose to hurt her. One professor died because his heart suddenly failed. The first death was caused by human violence. The second was caused by a medical emergency. One happened in front of several people. The other happened during a private meeting with one student. In both cases, an ordinary day changed without warning. That was what stayed with me most. At a small college, the people around you become part of the background of your life. You expect to see them tomorrow. You expect the offices to open, the professors to teach, and the students to continue moving through the halls. Death does not respect that expectation. The woman in financial aid went to work and was killed by a man who refused to leave her alone. The professor met with a student and suffered a fatal heart attack. Neither person knew that the day would be their last. The people around them did not know either. The college continued after both deaths, because institutions always continue. New employees were hired, new students enrolled. The semesters changed. Some people graduated without ever hearing what happened. Others never forgot. For the financial aid workers, the murder remained connected to their office. For the student who met with the professor, the heart attack remained connected to that conversation. For the campus police officers, the stabbing may have remained the call they wished they had reached sooner. They arrested the murderer, but they could not save the victim. That failure may have stayed with them even though they had done everything they could once they received the call. People often believe that being close to help means help will arrive in time. The financial aid office was on a college campus with its own police. The officers came quickly. It still was not fast enough. Violence can happen in seconds. The man needed only a brief amount of time to destroy a life and traumatize everyone in the room. The professor's death showed another limit. Even when people are nearby and willing to help, the body can fail too quickly for them to stop it. The student was present. Other staff came. Emergency responders were called. The professor still died. Both incidents left people facing the same difficult truth. Sometimes help arrives, people do their best, and the person cannot be saved. That truth is hard to accept because it removes the feeling of control. We prefer to believe every tragedy has a clear mistake that can be corrected. If a door had been locked, if the police had arrived sooner, if someone had noticed a symptom, or if CPR had begun faster, perhaps the person would still be alive. Sometimes those questions are useful. Sometimes they only cause pain. The estranged boyfriend was responsible for the woman's death. The witnesses were not responsible. Her co-workers did not fail her because they could not stop a man with a knife. The student was not responsible for the professor's heart attack. Being present did not mean the student had the power to save him. Understanding that logically does not always make the guilt disappear. Years later, I still thought about both incidents. The murder remained the more disturbing one because it was intentional. A human being had carried his anger into a workplace and killed someone in front of innocent people. He had made a decision. The professor's death was different, but its suddenness was frightening in another way. A healthy 40-year-old man could drop dead in the middle of a normal meeting. There was no enemy to blame and nobody to arrest. The heart simply stopped doing what everyone expected it to do. The college had seemed safe and ordinary before those events. Afterward, I understood how quickly ordinary places could become connected to death. An office could become a murder scene. A student meeting could become a medical emergency. People could arrive at work in the morning and never return home. I do not remember every normal day I spent at that college. Most of them have blended together. I remember the woman in financial aid. I remember learning that her estranged boyfriend had entered the college and stabbed her to death in front of her coworkers and students. I remember that campus police arrested him, but could not reach her in time. I remember the professor who appeared healthy and died of a heart attack while sitting with a student. And I remember how badly that student was affected. The campus eventually moved forward, but the people who saw those deaths carried them much longer. Some experiences do not disappear just because the office reopens or the next semester begins. They stay inside the people who were there. A knife entering an ordinary workplace, a professor collapsing during a quiet meeting, 2 normal days that ended with someone dead. Years later, those were the days I remembered most clearly. That story always reminds me of what happened to my husband's cousin while they were building their house. It was many years ago now, but it was the kind of death that stayed with the family because it was so sudden, so unnecessary, and so full of terrible irony. The man who died was not one of the builders. He was not a careless visitor who wandered onto the property without understanding the risks. He worked in safety. His job was to visit building sites and make sure everyone else was following the correct rules. He was supposed to check that workers had proper equipment, that dangerous areas were controlled, and that nobody was taking risks that could lead to a serious injury. Yet when he arrived at the site that day, he ignored the same basic rules he was responsible for enforcing, and it cost him his life. My husband's cousin and the rest of the family had been excited about the house. Building a home takes a long time, and every stage feels important when it belongs to you. First, there are plans, permits, and discussions about money. Then the ground is prepared, the concrete is poured, and the shape of the house slowly begins to appear. For a while, it does not look like a home at all. It is only dirt, timber, tools, and unfinished walls. Still, the family can already imagine where everything will be. They picture the kitchen, the bedrooms, and the place where they will sit together after the work is finally complete. The site was still under construction when the safety officer came to inspect it. From what I understand, nobody was working there at the time. The place was empty. That fact mattered because he should not have entered the site alone. Construction sites are dangerous even when no machines are running and no workers are moving materials. There can be loose boards, open edges, unfinished stairs, exposed metal, and ladders that have not been secured. If something goes wrong while a person is alone, there may be nobody nearby to call for help. The proper procedure was simple. He should have checked whether anyone was present. If the site was empty, he should have stayed outside, contacted the people responsible, and arranged to return when someone could meet him. At the very least, he should have signed in before entering. Signing in is not only paperwork, it creates a record showing that someone is on the property. In an emergency, that record can tell people who may still be inside or who was present when something happened. He did none of that. He entered the construction site without signing in. Nobody knew he was there. There was no builder, owner, or supervisor walking beside him. No one was watching as he moved through the unfinished house. If he saw a problem, there was nobody there to explain it. If he needed access to a higher area, there was nobody to hold a ladder or check whether it was secure. That alone would have been enough for him to criticize another worker. He probably would have written a warning if he had found someone else entering an empty site without permission or without recording their presence. He would have known exactly why that rule existed, yet for some reason, he did it himself. He was also not wearing proper safety equipment. He did not have a hard hat on. From the way the story was told to me, he was not wearing any of the protective gear that would normally be expected on a construction site. Maybe he had not planned to stay long. Maybe he thought he was only going to look around for a few minutes. Maybe he believed that because nobody was actively working, the site was not especially dangerous. That kind of thinking causes many accidents. People are often careful during large or obviously dangerous tasks, but they become relaxed when they believe they are doing something simple. They tell themselves they will only be there for a moment. They believe protective equipment is unnecessary because nothing is moving. They think the rules are mainly for other people, or for situations more dangerous than the one in front of them. The safety officer should have known better than almost anyone. He had probably seen the results of unsafe behavior before. He may have written reports about unsecured ladders, missing helmets, and people entering restricted areas alone. He may have told workers that even an experienced person can make one mistake. He may have explained that accidents do not give warnings and that familiar tasks can still become deadly. But knowledge does not always stop a person from becoming careless. Sometimes knowing the rules too well creates a false sense of confidence. A person begins to believe they understand the danger enough to control it. They may think the rule is meant for workers who are less experienced or less careful. Perhaps that was what happened to him. While he was on the site, he decided to climb to a higher area. I do not know exactly what he wanted to inspect. It may have been part of the roof, a wall, an upper level, or some section of the structure that could not be seen clearly from the ground. There was no ladder ready for him, so he placed one himself. Again, there was no one there to help. No one checked the angle of the ladder. No one held the bottom. No one watched to see whether the feet were standing on a solid surface. No one could warn him if it began to shift. He climbed without a hard hat and without anyone nearby. The details of the actual fall were never completely clear. The ladder may have slipped. He may have lost his footing. He could have reached too far to one side and thrown himself off balance. It is possible the surface under the ladder was uneven, or that the ladder had not been placed at the correct angle. Whatever happened, he fell. He did not land on soft soil or a pile of materials that might have reduced the force. He fell headfirst onto the concrete pad. The concrete was one of the strongest parts of the unfinished house. It had been designed to support the structure for decades. It did not move when he struck it. His body absorbed the full impact. He died there. The accident was not immediately discovered because nobody knew he had entered the site. He had not signed in, and he had not told anyone he was climbing the ladder. If someone had been there, they might have called an ambulance as soon as he fell. They might have been able to protect his neck, control bleeding, or begin first aid. We do not know whether faster help would have saved him, especially after a head-first fall onto concrete. But he did not even have that chance. He had placed himself in the exact situation safety rules are meant to prevent. He was alone, unrecorded, unprotected, and working at height without assistance. The man responsible for checking safety had broken nearly every important safety rule involved in his own death. When people learned what had happened, There must have been disbelief before anything else. A serious accident on a building site is terrible under any circumstances, but this one was difficult to understand because of who he was. If a young, untrained worker had made the same mistakes, people might have said he did not understand the risk. If a homeowner had climbed the ladder, people might have said they lacked proper experience. This man could not claim either of those things. He was the safety officer. He had been sent there because he understood the rules. His role was to protect other people from preventable accidents. Instead, his own decisions created one. I imagine the first people who arrived had trouble accepting what they saw. An empty construction site should not have contained anyone. Then they found the ladder, the man on the concrete, and no sign in record showing why he was there. Emergency services would have been called, but the damage was already done. A fall onto the head can cause severe injuries in a fraction of a second. The skull, brain, and neck cannot safely absorb that kind of force. Even a hard hat might not have guaranteed survival, but wearing one could have offered some protection. More importantly, following the full procedure might have prevented the fall entirely. If he had waited for someone to meet him, another person could have held the ladder. If he had signed in, people would have known he was on the property. If he had worn the required equipment, he would have had at least some protection. If he had decided not to enter an empty site, he would have gone home alive. The death was not caused by a hidden danger nobody could have predicted. It did not require a machine to fail or a structure to collapse. It happened because one person ignored several basic precautions. That made it even harder for the family. When someone dies because of an unavoidable illness or a completely unpredictable event, loved ones still grieve, but they may not be trapped by the same repeated questions. A preventable death creates a painful list of moments when a different decision could have changed everything. Why did he enter? Why did he not sign in? Why was he not wearing a hard hat? Why did he climb alone? Why did he set up the ladder without checking it with someone else? Why did a man trained to recognize danger take such obvious risks? There may never have been a satisfying answer. Perhaps he was in a hurry. He may have had several inspections to complete that day and did not want to return later. Maybe he saw no workers and believed he could finish the job more quickly by himself. He might have considered the inspection routine and believed he could handle it safely. Maybe he simply stopped thinking for a few minutes. It takes only a few minutes for a person to break rules that took years of experience to learn. The family also had to deal with the fact that he died on the site of their future home. Building a house is normally connected to hope and new beginnings. After the accident, the concrete pad became the place where a man had died. The house was still unfinished, but the story was already part of it. Every time the family visited the site, they knew what had happened there. They probably knew the general area where he had fallen. Even if the blood and signs of the accident had been cleaned, the concrete remained. Work may have stopped for a while. The site would have been investigated, especially because the person who died was a government safety employee. Officials would need to understand why he had entered alone and whether anyone else was responsible. They may have examined the ladder, the surface beneath it, and the unfinished structure. They would have checked records and asked who knew he was going there. They would have wanted to know whether he had contacted the builders or owners before arriving. The lack of a sign in record would have been important. The investigation may have reached the same simple conclusion the family already understood. He should not have been there alone. The builders had not told him to climb the ladder without equipment. The homeowners had not asked him to enter an empty site. He had made those decisions himself. That did not make his death easier to accept. In some ways, it made it worse. The family may also have worried that the death would always affect the feeling of the house. It is difficult to imagine living comfortably in a place where someone died before the walls were even complete. Even people who do not believe in ghosts can feel uneasy about that. A sudden death leaves an emotional weight. The place becomes connected to the final moment of a human life. The family had planned for the house to become a safe place. It was meant to hold meals, birthdays, quiet evenings, and ordinary family life. Now, before they had even moved in, the property was connected to a fatal accident. They made the decision to have the house blessed. I do not know every detail of the blessing. It may have been performed by a priest, minister, or another religious figure. The family likely wanted peace more than anything else. They wanted to acknowledge what had happened and then separate the future home from the fear and sadness connected to the accident. A house blessing can mean different things to different people. For some, it is a religious act asking for protection. For others, it is a way to make the space feel clean and peaceful again. It gives the family a moment to gather, remember the person who died, and decide that the tragedy will not control the home forever. Perhaps prayers were said in the unfinished rooms. Maybe the person performing the blessing walked through the property and stopped near the place where the man fell. The family may have spoken about him, or they may have remained quiet. The blessing could not change what happened. It could not make the safety officer return home. It could not remove the image of the ladder and the concrete pad. But it may have helped the family continue. Construction eventually resumed. The builders returned to the site. New walls covered parts of the structure. Floors were finished, doors were installed, and the empty concrete began to disappear beneath the completed home. The house slowly became what the family had planned before the accident. A kitchen was completed, bedrooms were prepared, furniture was carried inside, lights were connected. The building site became a home. Moving in may have felt strange at first. On the first night, the family might have been more aware of every sound. New houses make noises as materials settle and temperatures change. Pipes move, boards creak, and wind touches unfinished landscaping. After a death on the property, even normal sounds can feel more important. A small noise may cause someone to stop and listen. A shadow in the hallway might remind them of the story. But there were no reports of strange events in the story as I heard it. There were no unexplained footsteps, voices, or signs that the man remained there. The family had the house blessed, moved in, and continued with their lives. They have lived there for around 15 years, possibly longer now. That fact matters because it shows that the house did not remain only a place of death. It became the home it was meant to be. Over the years, the family created thousands of new memories there. They cooked meals, slept, celebrated holidays, argued, laughed, welcomed visitors, and watched time pass. Children may have grown older in those rooms. Furniture was probably moved and replaced. Walls were painted. Repairs were made. The unfinished site that once felt connected to tragedy became familiar. The accident remained part of the history, but it did not become the entire meaning of the house. Still, I imagine the family never completely forgot. Even after 15 years, the concrete beneath the finished home is the same concrete the safety officer fell onto. Somewhere below the floors and furniture is the place where his life ended. Visitors may enter without knowing. They may sit in the house, drink coffee, and talk without any idea that a man died during construction. The family knows. That kind of knowledge does not have to make a home frightening, but it adds a layer that other people cannot see. The tragedy also remained a powerful example of how quickly carelessness can become fatal. The man's job made the story especially difficult to forget. If anyone should have known not to enter an empty site, it was him. If anyone should have signed in, worn a hard hat, and used a ladder safely, it was him. His training did not protect him because he chose not to follow it. People sometimes believe expertise makes them less vulnerable. An experienced driver may take risks because they believe they can control the vehicle. A skilled worker may reach toward moving equipment because they understand how it operates. A safety professional may climb an unsecured ladder because they have inspected hundreds of sites before. Experience can improve safety, but only when the person still respects the rules. The safety officer may have felt more confident because he knew construction sites well. The empty property may have seemed quiet and harmless. There were no workers operating machines, no materials being lifted, and no obvious emergency. The danger was simple: a ladder and a hard surface. That was enough. The accident also showed that safety rules are not only for protecting people from complicated situations. Many of the most important rules control ordinary actions. Do not enter alone. Sign in. Wear protective equipment. Make sure the ladder is secure. Have someone nearby. None of those steps are difficult. They may feel unnecessary when nothing bad happens, but they are designed around the possibility that one small thing may go wrong. A foot can slip. A ladder can move. A person can lose balance. The difference between a frightening moment and a fatal accident may be a helmet, a second person, or someone knowing where you are. In his case, the protections were missing. Afterward, the organization he worked for may have used the accident as a warning to other employees. It would have been an uncomfortable case to discuss because it exposed a serious failure within the safety system itself. How do you tell workers to follow rules when the person enforcing those rules died while ignoring them? The answer is that the story makes the rules even more important. He was not killed because safety procedures failed to exist. He was killed because he did not use them. No amount of knowledge, authority, or government training could protect him once he climbed that ladder alone. It is easy to judge him from a distance. People can call the decision foolish and say they would never make the same mistake. But many people break small safety rules every day. They stand on chairs instead of using proper steps. They climb ladders without asking anyone to hold them. They enter work areas without signing in because they expect to leave quickly. They skip helmets because the job will only take a moment. Usually, nothing happens. That is why they keep doing it. The safety officer may have broken similar rules before and returned home safely. Each time could have made the next risk feel more acceptable. Then, on that construction site, the ladder or his footing failed. There was no second chance. The house blessing may also have helped the family deal with anger. It would have been easy to feel that the accident had damaged the home before they even entered it. They could have abandoned the project, sold the property, or refused to live there. Instead, they chose to continue. That decision did not mean they ignored the death. Having the house blessed showed that they took it seriously. They acknowledged the tragedy and then allowed life to move forward. 15 years is a long time. During those years, the house would have protected the family from storms, cold nights, and difficult days. It would have become the place they returned to after work and the place where they felt most comfortable. The concrete pad that caused the safety officer's fatal injuries also became the foundation supporting the family's home. That contrast is difficult to think about. Concrete has no intention. It was not responsible for the death. It was simply hard and unmoving, as a foundation must be. The ladder was not evil either. The accident came from the way ordinary objects, gravity, and one unsafe decision came together. There was nothing supernatural about the death. That made it more disturbing. It could have been prevented. Had the man followed the rules he taught others, he likely would have left the property safely. He could have called the builder and returned later. He could have signed in. He could have worn a hard hat. He could have waited for someone to hold the ladder. Instead, He entered alone and died alone. The family continued living with that knowledge, but they did not let it destroy the future they had planned. They finished the house. They had it blessed. They moved in. They stayed. When the story is told now, people often focus on the irony. A government safety employee died because he ignored basic safety precautions. That irony is almost impossible to miss. But behind it was a real person and a real family. Someone received a call saying he would not be coming home. Coworkers had to investigate the death of a man who had worked beside them and enforced the same rules he broke. My husband's cousin had to decide whether the house could still become a place of peace after someone died on its foundation. They chose to believe it could. The accident became part of the family's history, but the home collected many other stories over the following 15 years. The safety officer's death remained the first dark chapter connected to the property, not the final one. It was a terrible and completely preventable death. He arrived at an empty construction site. He entered without signing in. He wore no proper safety equipment. He placed a ladder by himself. He climbed with no one there to help. Then the ladder slipped, or he lost his footing, and he fell headfirst onto the concrete pad. The man whose job was to stop unsafe behavior died because of his own unsafe choices. The house was blessed afterward. The family moved in and continued living there for more than 15 years. Life filled the rooms that had once stood unfinished around the place where he died. But I doubt anyone in the family ever looked at construction safety in quite the same way again. The stories may be over, but some nights do not end when the video does. The people you heard tonight were not looking for fear. They were living normal lives until one moment changed the way they saw the world around them. Tell me in the comments which story stayed with you the longest. Subscribe to Nockmeyer Witness for more true accounts from people who saw something they wish they could forget. Good night, and if you wake up suddenly, do not assume it was just a dream.